It was the fall of 1994. In a quiet stretch of eastern Ohio where the hills turned copper in October. And nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. Cassie Voss was 26 years old and 8 months pregnant. On a cold, rainy Wednesday night, she checked into a small county hospital with her contractions 2 minutes apart. Sometime before dawn, she vanished without a trace. Her IV bag was still dripping. Her slippers were still under the bed. Her wedding ring was still sitting on the tray table beside a cup of melted ice. Police searched the fields, the reservoir, the roads. They found no body, no baby, and no evidence. The case quickly went cold. 24 years later, one small detail reopened all of it, and it revealed a truth no one was prepared for. If stories like this matter to you, take 1 second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who still look for answers. Now, let's get into today's case. Kettle Bend, Ohio, was the kind of town you could drive through in 90 seconds without ever knowing you'd been there. One traffic light, a feed store, a Methodist church with a bell that ran 4 minutes fast and had for as long as anyone could remember. In autumn, the hills came alive in rust and gold, and the whole valley smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves and the vinegar tang of the apple press behind the Sunberg place. Cassie Trelane grew up in a yellow house on Quarry Road, with a father who fixed pianos and a mother who fixed everything else. Her father was Hollis Trelane. He'd tuned every piano in 3 counties' church uprights, school auditorium grands, the wheezing spinet in the back room of the VFW hall. He carried his tools in a mahogany roll that his own father had stitched together out of an old saddle. Hollis had a rule he repeated so often it became a family joke. A note isn't wrong until you hear it against a true one. Cassie learned the trade at his elbow, starting at 9 years old. By 26, she was better than he'd been. She was small, 5'2" in work boots with dark hair she cut herself over the bathroom sink, and a laugh that came out too loud in quiet rooms. She had a crescent-shaped birthmark just under her left ear, about the size of a fingernail clipping. Her mother, Dot, had called it the moon since the day she was born. Cassie hated it as a teenager and covered it with her collar. By her 20s, she'd made peace with it, and she'd tuck her hair behind her ear on purpose when she laughed. She had habits people remembered. She kept peppermints loose in her coat pocket, no wrappers, so every coat she owned smelled of them. She wrote appointments on the inside of her left wrist in ballpoint pen, because she lost every notepad she'd ever been given. She hummed while she worked, badly, always a half step under the note she was tightening, which drove her father crazy and which she absolutely knew. She drove a 1981 Datsun pickup the color of an old penny, with a toolbox in the bed and a passenger door that only opened from the outside. And she had a brother. Wendell Trelane, everyone called him Dell, was 3 years older, built like a barn door, and had worked at Rauch's cabinet shop out on Route 9 since he was 18. He had sawdust in the creases of his knuckles year-round. He was slow to talk and slower to anger, and he had exactly one soft spot in the world, and her name was Cassie. When they were kids, their bedrooms shared a wall. They'd worked out a code. 2 knocks meant, "Are you awake?" 3 knocks meant, "Come here, something's wrong." 1 knock, just one, meant, "I'm okay, good night." They used that code for 20 years. Dell would tell people later, much later, that he still caught himself listening for it. In the spring of 1992, Cassie met Teddy Voss at a wedding reception in Ash Grove, where she'd been paid $40 to tune the reception hall piano and had stayed for the cake. Teddy was 30 then. Tall, sandy-haired, good teeth. The kind of man who remembered your mother's first name after meeting her once. He worked at his Uncle Garrick's funeral home, Voss and Marden. The only one in the county, and he had the mortician's gift of saying exactly the right sentence to a person on the worst day of their life. Everyone in Kettlebend liked Teddy Voss. Dell didn't. He couldn't explain it, and it embarrassed him, because he had nothing to point at. Teddy was polite. Teddy brought Dot flowers. Teddy shook his hand with both of his. But there was something about the way he laughed. Teddy always laughed a half-beat late, like a man translating a joke out of another language before he decided it was funny. And he had this habit of tapping his wedding band against whatever hard surface was nearest to the table. A coffee mug, the roof of a car, a light steady tick, 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 while he was thinking about something else entirely. They married in October of 1993 in the Methodist Church with the fast bell. Cassie wore Dot's dress taken in at the waist. Hollis had died of a stroke 2 years before, so Dell walked her down the aisle in a suit that pinched his shoulders, and he cried harder than she did, and she never let him forget it. For a while, it looked like the picture-perfect life. They rented a small white house on Delp Street with a porch swing and a crabapple tree. Cassie kept her tuning business and drove the Datsun to every rickety upright in the valley. Teddy got promoted to full apprentice and started handling services on his own. In February of 1994, Cassie called Dell at the shop in the middle of a workday, which she never did, and told him she was pregnant. He had to sit down on a stack of oak boards. "You're going to be an uncle," she said. "Try not to build the kid a whole nursery, Dell." He built her a whole nursery. He spent 4 months on it. A crib in white oak, hand-planed, no nails showing. A rocker with a curved back. A little chest of drawers with a wren burned into the top drawer. Because when they were kids, Cassie used to leave breadcrumbs on the windowsill for the wrens that nested under the eaves and got furious at anyone who scared them off. She cried when she saw it. Then she punched him in the arm hard enough to leave a mark. That was the summer of 1994. That was the last good summer. Looking back, Dell could count the warnings on one hand. That's the part that ate at him for the next 24 years. Not that there were no signs. That there were signs, and he'd looked right at them, and he'd let them go. The first was in July. He stopped by the house on Delp Street to drop off a spice rack he'd made for Dot, and got the address wrong in his head, and ended up there instead. Cassie was on the porch shelling peas into a colander, 4 months along, barefoot. When she reached up to take the rack from him, her sleeve slid back, and there were 4 oval bruises on the inside of her upper arm, spaced like fingers. "Piano bench," she said, before he could even ask. Slipped carrying one up the Hendricks stairs, landed on me. She said it fast, too fast, like a line she'd practiced on the drive home. Dell let it go. He would think about that for the rest of his life. The second was money. Cassie kept her tuning cash in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator 20s and 50s, folded lengthwise, the way Hollis had. In August, she mentioned, laughing, that she must be losing her mind, because she'd counted it twice and come up 200 short both times. She blamed herself. She said pregnancy had scrambled her arithmetic. The third was worse. In early September, Dell walked into Pruitt's Pawn in Ashgrove looking for a used belt sander. On the shelf behind the counter, under the glass, sat a tuning hammer with a rosewood handle, worn pale where a thumb had rested on it for 40 years. Hollis Trelane's tuning hammer. Dell stood there for a long moment with his ears ringing. Then he paid $65 for a tool that had belonged to his father and carried it out to his truck and sat in the parking lot with both hands on the wheel. He asked Cassie about it that night, gently. She went very still. Then she said Teddy had sold it, that he'd been short on something. that it was a misunderstanding, and she'd already screamed at him about it, and it was handled. He didn't know what it was, she said. Cass, he knew exactly what it was. She wouldn't look at him. Something felt wrong, really wrong. But she was 7 months pregnant and exhausted, and Dell was terrified of being the brother who blew up a marriage over a pawn ticket. So he handed her the hammer and he went home. There were other things, small ones, the kind you only line up afterward. The phone at Delp Street rang at odd hours, 11 at night, 1 in the morning, and Cassie said it was wrong numbers. And there sure were a lot of wrong numbers that fall. A brown Buick with a Pennsylvania plate parked across from the house, twice in September. Engine off, nobody getting out. Dot saw it once. Cassie said it was somebody's brother-in-law looking at the empty lot. Teddy started working nights, every night, which nobody questioned because people die at inconvenient hours and somebody has to go get them. And then, in the first week of October, Cassie asked Dell a question that he replayed 10,000 times. They were in Dot's kitchen. Cassie was eating saltines out of the sleeve because everything else made her sick. Dot was in the other room with the TV on. Cassie said, out of nowhere, not looking up, "Dell, if I ever had to go away for a while, just disappear for a while, would you find me?" He laughed. God help him. He laughed. He thought it was hormones and nerves and a woman 2 weeks from her due date saying the strange things pregnant women say at 11 o'clock at night. "Where would you go?" he said. "You can't even parallel park." She smiled at the table. She didn't answer. Then she said, "Just say yes." "Yes," he said. "Obviously yes." She nodded once like she was filing it somewhere. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Not then. It made perfect, terrible sense later. October 19th, 1994 was a Wednesday, and it rained all day. Not a storm. Just that steady, patient Ohio rain that starts before you wake up and is still going when you go to bed, drumming on gutters, turning the leaves in the road into a brown paste. Cassie's contractions started around 4 in the afternoon while she was tuning the upright at Kettlebend Elementary. She finished the job. Of course she did. She wrote the invoice out on the music stand, told the janitor the middle C had been flat since the Carter administration, and drove herself home. At 6, she called her mother. Dot drove her to St. Ambrose County Hospital in Ash Grove, 22 minutes down Route 9 with the wipers on high. Cassie was calm. She was joking. She said if it was a girl, she was naming her Wren, and Teddy could complain about it later. Teddy was working. There'd been a death that morning, Ida Pruitt, 91 years old, out on Cotton Hollow Road, and he was at the funeral home preparing her for a Friday service. He said he'd come as soon as he could. He said first babies take forever. They admitted Cassie at 7:40 p.m., room 214. St. Ambrose was a small hospital, 60 beds, built in 1958. That fall, the maternity wing was half torn apart for a remodeled plastic sheeting stapled over 2 doorways. The smell of joint compound in the hall. Room 214 was at the far end, past the construction, the last door before the stairwell. There were 2 other mothers on the floor that night, both at the other end. There was one nurse. Her name was Bernadette Cheatham. She was 51, 28 years on the job. And she would spend the rest of her life answering questions, about 6 hours of it. Dot stayed until 11. Cassie's labor had slowed. It happens, they told her. Go home, get some sleep. We'll call. Dot kissed her daughter's forehead and drove home through the rain with the radio off. That was the last time anyone in the Trelane family saw Cassie alive. Nurse Cheatham checked on her at 1:40 in the morning. She'd remember it exactly, because they made her say it exactly, over and over, for months. Cassie was sitting up in bed with the covers off, one hand on her belly, watching the window. The rain was loud on the flat roof over the wing. Cheatham checked the monitor, checked the IV, asked how she was doing. Cassie said she was fine. Then she asked for apple juice. Cheatham said she'd bring some. She walked down the hall to the nurse's station, took a call from a doctor about a patient on the second floor, poured a cup of juice from the little refrigerator, and walked back. 25 minutes, maybe 28. Room 214 was empty. The bed was not made exactly, but the blanket pulled up, smoothed, the way a person does out of habit. The IV line was disconnected at the cannula, and the loose end had been taped neatly to the pole so it wouldn't drip on the floor. She'd done it herself, carefully, like someone who didn't want to leave a mess. Her hospital slippers were side by side under the bed. Her overnight bag was still on the chair nightgowns, a paperback, a toothbrush, the little folder of insurance papers. And on the tray table, next to a cup of ice that had melted to water, was her wedding ring. Cheatham checked the bathroom. She checked the linen room. She walked the hall calling her name and got no answer. And then she ran. They searched the whole building in 40 minutes. Basement to roof. The chapel, the boiler room, the loading dock, the parking lots, the strip of woods behind the generator shed. 2 orderlies went out in the rain with flashlights and came back soaked. Nothing. Her Datsun was in the driveway on Delp Street where she'd left it. Her purse was in the truck. Her coat, the brown corduroy one with the peppermints in the pocket, was gone from the closet in room 214. And one more thing was gone. One small detail that nobody but her family understood the weight of. In her overnight bag, in the zipper pocket, Cassie had packed her father's tuning fork. A steel A440, tarnished at the stem, the letter H scratched into it with a nail. She carried it everywhere, sir. She'd packed it to bring to the hospital because she said she wanted the baby to hear a true note first thing, before anything else in the world. She left her wedding ring on the table. She took the tuning fork. At the end of the maternity hall, by the stairwell door, there was a payphone. When the night janitor came through at 2:15 a.m., the receiver was hanging off the hook on its silver cord, swinging slightly, an inch above the floor. Nobody could ever say who had used it. By 4 in the morning, there were 3 sheriff's cruisers in the hospital lot, with their lights turning red across the wet brick. By 7, Del Trelane was standing in room 214 in his work clothes, staring at his sister's slippers under the bed, and the whole world had gone quiet and strange, like his head was underwater. Teddy arrived at 7:20. He came in fast, shirt untucked, eyes red. He grabbed a doctor by the arm and demanded answers in a shaking voice. He held Dot while she cried into his chest in the hallway. He was very, very good. Del watched him from across the corridor, watched him hold their mother, and watched his right hand, hanging loose at his side behind Dot's back, tapping his wedding band against his thigh. Tick, tick, tick. The man they gave the case to was a county detective named Ray Basker. Basker was 44, thick through the middle, with a gray brush cut and a tie he fastened with a bent paperclip because he'd lost the clip his wife bought him and never replaced it. He smoked Pall Malls down to the filter and pinched them out and put the dead ones back in the pack, a habit from 20 years earlier that he couldn't shake. He was not a brilliant man, and he never claimed to be. He was a thorough one, and he worked that case like his own name was on it. They brought in K-9 units from 2 counties on the morning of the 20th. The dogs took Cassie's scent off the nightgown in her bag and hid immediately out of room 214, down the back stairwell, through the service corridor, out the loading dock door on the north side of the building. Then the trail ran 12 feet across wet asphalt and stopped. Just stopped. The rain had been coming down for 18 hours. The handlers worked the lot in grids for 4 more hours and got nothing. Whatever happened, it happened at the edge of that loading dock apron. And then she was in a vehicle, or she was carried, or the water took the rest. They dragged Sheila Reservoir for 6 days. Divers went into the quarry pond. Volunteers 300 at the peak, half the town in orange vests, walked the fields off Route 9, shoulder to shoulder, turning over corn stubble in the cold. They found a child's boot, a deer carcass, and 11 pounds of garbage. The hospital had exactly 1 security camera, mounted in the front lobby, aimed at the main doors. The tape showed nothing but the doors, the rain, and Bernadette Cheatham crossing the frame twice. Nobody had been watching the loading dock. There wasn't a camera within 100 yards of it. Then, on October 23rd, a county road crew clearing a culvert found something in a drainage ditch on Route 9, 6 miles south of the hospital, half in the water. A hospital blanket, white cotton, blue stripe on the hem, and the words St. Ambrose County stamped in faded ink at the corner. Inventory confirmed it was one of theirs. Room 214's most likely, though they couldn't prove which bed it came from. And there was a mark on it. A smear across one corner, about the size of a palm print, pinkish and waxy, like something greasy had been wiped off on it. The state lab in Columbus ran it in November of 1994 with the equipment they had in 1994. It wasn't blood. It wasn't motor oil. It wasn't lipstick or foundation or any cosmetic in their reference set. It wasn't automotive grease or hand cream or theatrical makeup. The report came back with 2 words in the results field: unknown compound. Basker read that report probably 400 times over the next 2 decades. It was the one thing in the whole file that refused to fit anywhere. A pink, waxy substance on a hospital blanket in a ditch on a county road. He knew, the way a cop knows, that it meant everything. He just couldn't make it mean anything. They looked hard at the husband. They always do, and they should. Teddy Voss came in voluntarily, twice. He was cooperative, tearful, and consistent. He'd been at Voss and Marden all night, from about 9 in the evening until past 6 in the morning, preparing Ida Pruitt for her Friday service and finishing paperwork. His uncle Garrick Voss confirmed it. Garrick was 72, a deacon, a man who had buried half the county's parents. He said he'd been in the office upstairs until 2 and heard Teddy working below him the whole time. Nobody in Kettle Bend was going to call Garrick Voss a liar. They gave Teddy a polygraph in December. The examiner marked it inconclusive on 2 questions and noted the subject was visibly grieving and had not slept. They found no life insurance policy on Cassie, no affair, no motive on paper. So the theories drifted. Some in the department landed on a stranger abduction, a predator who saw a vulnerable woman in a half-empty wing on a rainy night. It happens. It's rare, and it happens. Others, quietly, said she ran. That theory spread through town like a stain. A 26-year-old about to have her first baby, panicking, walking out into the night. People pointed at the missing money from the coffee can and got it exactly backwards. They said maybe she'd been saving to leave. They said maybe there was another man. Somebody at the diner said she'd always been odd, that girl, humming to herself in people's houses. Dot Trelane heard a woman say it in the checkout line at the IGA in January. and had to leave a full cart in the aisle. Del heard it too. Del heard all of it. The tip line took 240 calls. A trucker swore he'd seen a woman in a dark coat walking south on the shoulder of Route 9 around 2:30 that morning, in the rain, and that he'd slowed and she'd turned her face away. He couldn't describe her. He couldn't say if she was pregnant. He hadn't stopped. And he called about it in February and cried on the phone. That was the closest thing to a sighting they ever got. By the spring of 1995, the volunteers had gone back to their lives. By that summer, the flyers in the feed store window had gone yellow and curled at the corners. Cassie Voss and her unborn daughter had vanished without a trace, and the case quickly went cold. Ray Basker boxed the file in September of 1996. Then, against regulations, he ran a second copy of everything on the department copier over 3 lunch breaks and took it home in a banker's box and put it on a shelf in his garage. He told his wife he'd get to it. 23 years passed. That sentence takes 1 second to say. Living it is something else. Dot Trelane put a candle in the front window of the yellow house on Quarry Road the first night, meaning to take it down when Cassie came home. She never took it down. For 13 years, there was a light in that window, and every neighbor on Quarry Road knew exactly what it meant, and nobody ever said a word about it. She kept Cassie's bedroom the way it was. She kept the nursery Del built, too. Teddy gave it back in 1996 when he moved out of the house on Delp Street. And Del hauled the crib and the rocker and the little chest of drawers with the wren on it up to his mother's spare room and set them up again, because she asked him to, and because he could not think of a single reason to say no. Dot went to the sheriff's office every October 19th for 8 years, then every other year. Then she stopped going and started calling instead. And then the calls got shorter. And then they were just a woman on the phone saying her daughter's name to a receptionist who hadn't been born yet. She died in March of 2007, 69 years old. The certificate said congestive heart failure. Del knew the other word for it. He buried her next to Hollis in Fairhaven Cemetery on the slope behind the maintenance shed. And he had the stone cut with room left on the right-hand side. He never explained that to anybody. He just told the monument company to leave the space. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The years did what years do. Del married Peg Rauch, the boss's daughter, in 1998. They had a girl, Nora, in 2001. He took over the cabinet shop when old man Rauch's hands went. He coached softball. He got gray. He was, by every outside measure, a happy man. But every October, on the 19th, he took the day off and walked the shoulder of Route 9 from the hospital to the culvert where they'd found the blanket. 6 miles, rain or shine. He never told anybody why, and nobody ever asked, because in a town that size, everybody already knows. Peg would have coffee waiting when he got back, and never once said a word about it. That was its own kind of love. And Teddy Voss got on with things. That was the part that put an acid taste in Del's throat for 24 years. Teddy remarried in 1999. A woman named Sheila from Ash Grove with 2 boys from her first marriage. He bought out his Uncle Garrick in 2003, and the sign changed from Voss and Marden to Voss Family Funeral Home in Gold Leaf. He joined the Rotary Club. He sponsored the Little League team. And every summer, 12 9-year-olds ran around the diamond in Kettle Bend with Voss family across their backs. He offered to bury Dot Trelane in 2007 at cost. Del said no in a voice that made Peg put a hand on his arm. They saw each other maybe twice a year, at the hardware store or the gas station on Miller. Teddy always said hello, Always warm, always sad, always the same sentence. Still nothing, Dell. Still nothing. Ray Basker retired in 2011 with a plaque and a sheet cake. The banker's box went from the garage shelf to a corner of the basement, and he told himself he'd get to it. And then his wife got sick, and then she died. He never threw it out. By 2017, Cassie Voss had been gone longer than she'd been alive. There were people working at that hospital who'd never heard of her. Her name came up once every few years in an online forum about unsolved cases. And the thread always died the same way, with 3 or 4 strangers agreeing that she'd probably just started over somewhere. Then, in 2018, everything suddenly changed. It started with a Christmas present, which is the way these things almost always start now. In December of 2017, Peg bought 3 mail-order DNA kits at the pharmacy in Ashgrove because they were on sale and because she'd gotten tired of hearing Dell claim at every family gathering for 2 decades that the Trelanes were 1/8 Cherokee on his grandmother's side. "Prove it," she said, and dropped the box in his lap on Christmas morning. Nora thought it was hilarious. Dell spat in the tube at the kitchen table on December 26th, while the dog watched him with real concern and mailed it off and forgot about it completely. The results came back in February. He was disappointingly extremely German. Nora laughed for a solid week, and that would have been the end of it, except the account stayed active. And in the settings, there was a checkbox, already ticked by default, that opted him into the relative matching database. On the morning of March 8th, 2018, Dell Trelane was in the shop finishing a set of maple drawer fronts when his phone buzzed in his back pocket. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at it. An email, subject line, "You have a new close family match." He almost deleted it. He thought it was more advertising. He opened it standing at the bench with the dust collector roaring. Predicted relationship. Niece. Shared DNA. 1,742 centimorgans. Confidence. Very high. Dell read it 3 times. Then he shut off the dust collector, and the shop went completely silent. And he stood there in the quiet, with sawdust settling on his forearms. He didn't have a niece. He had 1 sibling, and she had died, or gone, or been taken. Nobody knew which, 23 years and 5 months earlier, 8 months pregnant, in a hospital in Ashgrove. He sat down on an overturned bucket. His hands were shaking so hard, he had to hold the phone in both of them to tap the link. The profile was almost empty. That's the thing people don't realize. There's no dramatic file. There's just a username, a state, and if you're lucky, a picture. Junie Pardo, 1994, Erie, Pennsylvania. And a photograph. A young woman on a wooden dock in summer, maybe 22, 23, squinting into the sun with her hand up, shading her eyes. Dark hair. Small, you could tell even sitting down, the way her feet didn't reach the water. Laughing at whoever was holding the camera. Dell zoomed in with 2 fingers, the way his daughter had taught him. And what he saw made his blood run cold. She was laughing with her head tipped back and her hair tucked behind her left ear. And just below that ear, in the sunlight, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark, about the size of a fingernail clipping. The moon. Dell Trelane sat on an overturned bucket in a cold cabinet shop on Route 9 and made a sound he'd never made before. And Peg heard it from the office and came running, and found her husband holding a telephone against his chest, with both hands like he was trying to keep something from getting out. He didn't sleep that night. He wrote and deleted the message 11 times. "What do you say?" "Hello. I think you might be my sister's daughter. And my sister disappeared before you were born. Every version of it sounded like a scam or a lunatic or both." At 4:40 in the morning, he sent this. My name is Wendell Trelane. I live in Kettle Bend, Ohio. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to. My sister Cassie went missing from a hospital in Ash Grove, Ohio on October 19th, 1994. She was 8 months pregnant. Nobody ever found her or the baby. I saw your birthday is 1994. I saw the mark under your ear. My sister had one exactly the same, in the same place. Our mother called it the moon. I'm sorry if this is upsetting. I've waited 23 years, and I don't know how to be gentle about it. She answered at 9:15 that morning. I think I need to sit down. Her name was Junie Pardo. She was 23. She worked at a garden center outside Erie, Pennsylvania, and took night classes in accounting. She'd been raised by Emil and Ruth Pardo in a brick house 2 blocks off Buffalo Road. And she'd been told her whole life that she was adopted privately, quietly, from a young mother who couldn't keep her. Ruth had told her the story the same way every time, in the same words, which Junie had loved as a child and had started to notice as an adult. There were no papers. That was the thing that had always sat wrong. Junie had gone looking at 19, when she needed a copy of her birth certificate for a passport. And what she'd gotten from the county was a delayed registration filed in December of 1994. A document created weeks after the fact, on the word of the parents, sires, in a system that in 1994 asked far fewer questions than anyone now would believe. Date of birth listed, October 20th, 1994. Place of birth, at home. Ruth had died of pancreatic cancer in 2015. Emil was 81 and had been in memory care on the east side of Erie since 2016. On good days, he knew Junie's face. On bad days, he asked her when Ruth was coming back from the store. Junie had taken the DNA test in November of 2017 for the most ordinary reason in the world. She wanted to know if she had her mother's hands. They met 9 days later, on a Saturday, at the Wheelhouse Diner off the highway in Kono, halfway between them. Dell got there 50 minutes early and drank 4 cups of coffee and read the same laminated menu until the words stopped meaning anything. She came in at 11, wearing a green canvas jacket, and Dell stood up too fast and knocked his spoon on the floor. She was 5'2". She had dark hair she'd cut herself badly, and she apologized for it in the first 30 seconds without being asked. And when she got nervous, she laughed too loud in a quiet room. Dell had to put his hand over his mouth and look out the window for a while, and she let him. And when he could talk again, the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry, you sound like her." They talked for 5 hours. The waitress stopped bringing the check. He told her about Cassie, about the pianos and the peppermints, and the ballpoint on her wrist and the humming a half-step flat, about the crib with the wren burned into the drawer, about the night of October 19th and the untouched room and the ring on the tray table and the tuning fork that wasn't in the bag. Junie went very quiet at that part. "Say that again," she said. "The tuning fork." "Steel, about this long, tarnished. Our dad scratched an H in the handle with a nail." Junie Pardo put both hands flat on the table. "I have that," she said. "It's in my apartment. It's in a shoebox in my closet, and it has been my whole life." The shoebox was a Buster Brown box, kid-sized, soft at the corners from 30 years of being moved. Ruth Pardo had given it to her on her 18th birthday and said only, "This came with you." Junie brought it to Dell's kitchen table in Kettle Bend the following weekend and took the lid off with both hands. Inside, an infant's hospital bracelet, the tiny plastic kind, with the printed name field completely blank. A square of white cotton cut from something larger, with half a blue stripe running through it. A steel tuning fork tarnished at the stem, with the letter H scratched into the handle with a nail. A Polaroid photograph, an older woman with a gray perm and reading glasses on a chain, sitting in a kitchen chair, holding a newborn wrapped in a towel. The woman is not smiling. She is looking straight into the camera like she wants a record of something. And a business envelope, yellowed, sealed, with 6 words written across it in blue ballpoint in a slanted, careful hand. For the girl, when she asks. Junie had never opened it. She'd almost opened it a dozen times at 18, at 20, the night Ruth died. She said she'd always stopped for the same reason, which he couldn't explain and which Dell understood completely. Because once you open it, she said, whatever's in there is true. Dell picked up the square of white cotton with the blue stripe and turned it over in his hands, and he felt the floor tilt. He'd stood in a police station in 1994 and looked at a full-size version of that exact hem. They found out who the woman in the Polaroid was in about 4 minutes, because Junie recognized her. Marlene Kettleson, Ruth Pardo's older sister, Junie's great-aunt, as far as she'd ever known a woman who'd visited maybe twice a year when Junie was small, who'd sent a card every October with a $2 bill in it, and who had run a roadside diner in Ohio called the Blue Heron until her knees gave out. The Blue Heron sat on Route 9, 4.5 miles south of St. Ambrose County Hospital. Marlene Kettleson had died in 2009. Dell took all of it to the sheriff's office in Ash Grove on a Tuesday morning in April. He sat across from a lieutenant named Paget, maybe 38, perfectly polite, who explained kindly why none of it was a crime. A DNA test proves a family relationship. It does not prove a homicide. An informal adoption in 1994 was, at worst, a paperwork problem, and the 2 people who'd arranged it were dead or non-competent. The blanket fragment was a piece of cloth. The bracelet was blank. The envelope was unopened, and therefore, at this moment, was nothing at all. Mr. Trelane, I'm not saying you're wrong, Paget said. I'm saying I can't open a 24-year-old case on a hunch and a shoebox. Dell drove home and sat in the truck in his own driveway for an hour. Then he went inside and dug through Dot's old address book, the one with the cracked vinyl cover, and found a name and a number in his mother's handwriting, written in 1994 and rewritten twice since. Ray Basker answered on the 6th ring. The old detective lived in a low brick ranch by the reservoir with a dog he claimed he didn't like. He was 71. He'd gotten smaller. He listened to Dell talk for 11 minutes without saying a single word, sitting at his kitchen table with his hands folded. Then he got up, walked out to the garage, and came back 10 minutes later carrying a banker's box with a smashed corner and the word Trelane written on the end in marker that had faded to lavender. He set it on the table. I've been waiting for a phone call about this box for 22 years, he said. They went through it until 2 in the morning. Basker knew that file the way some men know scripture. He laid the Polaroid next to the crime scene photos of room 214. He laid the cloth square next to the lab photograph of the blanket from the ditch. Then he stopped. He put on his reading glasses and held the 1994 lab photograph under the kitchen light for a long, long time, looking at the pink, waxy smear in the corner. 24 years, he said. 24 years I could not name this. Name what? Basker set the photo down. When I was a young cop, I worked a car wreck out on 218. Bad one. 2 kids. I stood in the back room of Voss and Martin at 11 o'clock at night while old Garrick worked on that boy so his mother could see his face at the service. He tapped the photograph. There was a jar on his bench. Cream. Pink, waxy, greasy as lard. tinted for the cheeks and the hands. You wipe it off on a rag when you're done because it doesn't come off your fingers otherwise. Dell's blood ran cold. Basker made a phone call the next morning to a woman he'd trained with who now ran a section at the state lab in Columbus. She pulled the 1994 sample. It was still there, in an evidence freezer, because Basker had flagged it for retention every 5 years for 2 decades, on a form nobody else ever bothered with. They ran it in June of 2018 on equipment that hadn't existed in 1994. The result came back in 11 days. A petroleum-based cosmetic wax with a specific iron oxide pigment blend, consistent with a mortuary tissue cream marketed to funeral homes in the Midwest between roughly 1979 and 1997, when the manufacturer discontinued the line. It had been on a hospital blanket in a drainage ditch on Route 9, 400 yards from the Blue Heron Diner, on the morning of October 23, 1994. Lieutenant Paget opened the case 8 days later. Dell went to see Teddy Voss before any of that came back. He couldn't help himself. Peg begged him not to. It was a Thursday in May. The funeral home sat on the corner of Church and Miller with white pillars and a flowering pear tree out front dropping petals on the walk. Teddy was in the casket showroom with a clipboard. He was 55 now, silver at the temples, a little thick through the jaw, in a gray suit with no tie. He looked up and his whole face opened into that warm, sad, practiced expression. "Dell," he said. "My God. Are you all right? Is it Peg?" Dell put the Polaroid on the lid of a bronze-colored casket and slid it across. Teddy looked down at it. And Dell watched something happen behind his eyes that he would try to describe for the rest of his life and never quite manage. It wasn't shock. It wasn't grief. It was arithmetic. Teddy Voss looked at a photograph of a newborn baby he had never seen. And the first thing that crossed his face was a man doing math. "I don't know what this is," he said. "That's Cassie's daughter. Dell, she's 23. She's got the mark under her ear. She was born the night Cass disappeared, and somebody carried her 4 miles down Route 9 in a hospital blanket." Teddy set the clipboard down on the casket, very carefully, like it was heavy. "You've been carrying this a long time," he said, in that soft, warm, funeral home voice. "And I understand. I do. But people have taken advantage of grieving families with these DNA websites, and I would hate to see you. Where is she, Teddy? You should go home, Wendell." And there it was, underneath the warmth, flat and cold and quick, and gone again in half a second. Dell picked up the Polaroid. At the door he turned around, and Teddy Voss was standing exactly where he'd left him, in the middle of a room full of empty caskets under recessed lighting. His right hand was down at his side. Tick, tick, tick. The thing that broke it open wasn't the DNA in the end. It wasn't the birthmark or the letter or the tuning fork. It was a burial vault invoice. When Paget's warrant came through in July, they took 9 boxes of records out of the funeral home basement. Ledgers, service files, receipts going back to 1961. All of it kept because Garrick Voss had never thrown away a piece of paper in his life. Ida Pruitt's file was 3 pages thick. Died October 19, 1994, at home on Cotton Hollow Road, age 91. Prepared by Tia Voss. Service Friday, October 21st, at Fairhaven Cemetery. Closed casket at the family's request noted on the 2nd page in Teddy's handwriting, and something 2 surviving nieces would later say they had never asked for and had found strange at the time. The grave had been opened on the 20th, a day early, by a contractor who was paid in cash. And clipped to the back was the delivery ticket from the vault company in Ashgrove. Standard concrete burial vault. and in the box at the bottom where the operator logged the weight for the lowering equipment, someone had written a number and circled it, the way you circle a number that looks wrong. 491 pounds. Ida Pruitt weighed 96 pounds when she died. Ray Basker looked at that ticket in a conference room in Ashgrove with 6 other people around the table. And he took his glasses off and put a hand over his eyes, and nobody said anything for a while. She had never left the county. She had never even left the road. For 24 years, Cassie Voss had been 1,100 feet from her own mother's headstone, on the slope behind the maintenance shed at Fairhaven Cemetery, under a legally buried 91-year-old woman with a stone and flowers and a mowed lawn. That was why the dogs found nothing. That was why the divers found nothing. That was why 300 people in orange vests walked the fields for a week and found a child's boot and a deer. Nobody searches consecrated ground. They exhumed the grave on October 9th, 2018, in the rain. Dell stood at the fence line with Junie beside him and Basker on the other side, none of them talking, watching a green tarp go up around a hole in the ground. They lifted Ida Pruitt's casket out at 11:20 in the morning. Underneath it, in the bottom of the vault, wrapped in a hospital blanket with a blue stripe on the hem, were the skeletal remains of a young woman. The forensic anthropologist from the state confirmed it in under a week with dental records from a clinic in Ashgrove that had closed in 1999 and whose files were in a storage unit because one hygienist couldn't bring herself to shred them. It was her. There were 2 other findings in that report. The small bone in her throat was fractured. In a 26-year-old woman, the report noted. That does not happen by accident. And the changes to her pelvis showed she had given birth. Junie Pardo opened Marlene Kettleson's envelope that night at Dell's kitchen table, with Peg and Nora and Ray Basker in the room, because she had said all along she couldn't do it until she knew. 3 pages, front and back, in blue ballpoint, written in November of 1994 and sealed for 24 years. To whoever reads this, my name is Marlene Kettleson, and I own the Blue Heron on Route 9. I am writing this down because I'm too much of a coward to say it out loud, and because a lie kept in a person's head dies with them, and this one shouldn't. On the night of October 19th, 1994, at about 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, a girl came into my diner in a hospital gown and a brown corduroy coat with no shoes on. She was soaked through to the skin, and she was in labor. Her name was Cassie. I want that written down. Her name was Cassie, and she was not out of her mind. And she was not running away from anything. She was the most clear-headed person I have ever had in that building. She told me she had woken up in her hospital room and heard her husband on the payphone in the hallway outside her door. He didn't know she was awake. He thought she was under. She heard him tell a man that the baby was coming that night, and it would be a clean handoff, and there wouldn't be any paperwork problem, because there was a lawyer in Youngstown who did this and had done it before. She heard him say a number, $25,000. She heard him say his wife would come around after, or she wouldn't get a say. She lay in that bed and listened to the father of her child sell her baby to pay off a card debt. So she took the needle out of her own arm and taped the line up so it wouldn't wet the floor. And she left her wedding ring on the table where he'd be sure to find it. And she walked out the back of that hospital into the rain. She walked 4.5 miles in the dark in October, barefoot, 8 months gone, stopping in the ditch when the pains came. She wasn't running away. Understand that. She was carrying her daughter out of that building the only way she could. Her girl was born upstairs over the diner at about 10 after 4 in the morning. I have delivered 2 calves and no babies, and I would not wish that hour on anyone. But she came out screaming, 7 pounds if she was an ounce. And she was perfect. Cassie held her about 40 minutes. She kept a little steel fork in her coat pocket, one of those things piano men use. And she hid it on the bed frame and held it by that baby's ear and told her that was an A. And everything else in the world was going to be measured against it. She named her Wren. Then she asked to use my telephone. I begged her not to. I want that written down too. I got on my knees on the linoleum, 52 years old, and begged her to let me drive the both of them to my sister's in Erie right then. She said if she disappeared with the baby, he would look for the baby, and he would find her, because it is a small county, and he knew every road in it. She said if she went to him alone, he would only be looking for her. She said, and I will hear this until I die, he can have me. He is not getting her. She called him and told him to meet her at the funeral home, alone. She told him she'd sign whatever he wanted. She asked me for 20 minutes head start and a coat, and she gave me her daughter. I drove to Erie at first light with a newborn in a laundry basket on the passenger seat. And I gave her to Ruth, who had wanted a baby for 11 years. And I did not call the police. And that is my sin, and I will not dress it up. I was afraid of that family. That is the whole truth, and it is not good enough. They buried everybody in that county. His uncle was a deacon. I was a widow with a diner and a mortgage, and I had 4 miles of empty road between me and anyone who would have believed a word I said. And I thought, if they find her alive, she can come get her girl. She never came. To the girl, if you are reading this, your mother was not a woman who left you. Your mother was a woman who walked 4.5 miles in the rain, in the dark, to make sure nobody could ever take you. And then she went and stood in front of the thing that was coming, so it would look at her instead of you. I kept the fork. I always meant it to go back to her. Marlene Kettleson, November 1994. Nobody in that kitchen spoke for a long time. Then Junie Pardo Wren Trelane, born October 20th, 1994, at 4:10 in the morning over a diner on Route 9, put her face in her hands and cried the way you cry when you finally get to stop carrying a question. Del came around the table and put his arms around a woman he'd known for 7 months and had been waiting for since 1994. Teddy Voss was arrested on November 2nd, 2018, in the parking lot of the Rotary Club. He confessed in March of 2019, 3 weeks before trial, after his lawyer saw the vault ticket and the cosmetic wax report and the letter and did the arithmetic himself. His version was that she'd come at him, that she'd been screaming in the prep room at 4 in the morning, that she'd grabbed at his face, that he'd put his hands on her throat to hold her back, and hadn't understood what he'd done until she was on the floor. The state pointed out the fracture and the grave he had dug a day early and paid for in cash, and the fact that a man who is holding someone back does not, at dawn, drive 6 miles down Route 9 to throw a hospital blanket in a ditch. The lawyer in Youngstown had died in 2004. The debt had been about $19,000, owed to a man who ran card games behind a body shop in Ash Grove. Teddy Voss had gone to a payphone in a maternity ward and offered him a child. He was sentenced to life without parole in June of 2019. He was 56 years old. Sheila filed the week of the sentencing. The gold leaf came off the building that August. They buried Cassie Trelane on a Saturday in September, on the slope behind the maintenance shed at Fairhaven Cemetery, in the empty space on the right-hand side of her mother's stone that Del had left there in 2007 and had never once explained to anybody. It rained. Of course it rained. Bernadette Cheatham came, 81 years old, and stood at the back with a cane, And Dell walked over and thanked her, and she cried and said she should have brought the juice faster, and he told her, holding both her hands, that it never would have mattered, that his sister had already made up her mind, and that no one on earth had ever talked Cassie Trelane out of anything. Ray Basker came in the suit he'd retired in. He stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and didn't say a word until it was over. Then he told Dell, quietly, that he'd finally gotten to it. Afterward, everyone walked down to the Methodist church with the fast bell, and there was ham and green bean casserole in the fellowship hall. And Junie found the upright piano in the corner by the coat rack. She sat down without asking anyone. She played by ear she always had, since she was 4, and nobody in the Pardo family had ever known where it came from. Halfway through the second verse of something old, she stopped and frowned at the keyboard and hit one key 3 times. "That E is flat," she said. The whole room went quiet. Del Trelane laughed out loud in a church basement, with tears running down his face, and went out to his truck in the rain and came back with a mahogany tool roll stitched together out of an old saddle and set it on the piano bench beside his sister's daughter. "Your grandfather's," he said, "then your mom's." He had to stop and get his voice back. "You've got her hands." 24 years is a long time to be told a story that isn't true. For 24 years, people in that valley said Cassie Voss ran off. They said it in checkout lines and at church suppers and on the internet, and they said it comfortably, the way people say things about the missing when the missing can't answer. She never ran anywhere but toward her daughter. She left her ring and took a tuning fork. She took the needle out of her own arm and taped the line so it wouldn't wet the floor. Because even then, even walking out into the worst night of her life, she was the kind of person who didn't want to leave a mess for someone else. She walked 4.5 miles in the rain. And then she made a phone call she knew she would not come back from, so that a woman she'd met an hour earlier could get a 20-minute head start with a baby in a laundry basket. That's not a woman who vanished. That's a woman who stood in a doorway. The people who disappear are not always running away from us. Sometimes they are running at something, so it never reaches the person behind them. And the truth about them can be buried under concrete, under a stranger's casket, under a mowed lawn, and a headstone, and 24 years of a whole town being sure, and it will still, somehow, find a way up into the light. A blanket in a ditch, a mark under an ear, a note in a shoebox. One small detail, waiting. Cassie's daughter tunes pianos now, in Erie, out of a mahogany roll with an H scratched into the handle of the hammer. She hums while she works, a half-step flat every time. In the end, love proved stronger than the darkness, and the truth, no matter how deep it's buried, never stays down forever.